Ladies and gentlemen, throughout history, countless prisoners have endured unthinkable torture, yet some have defied the odds, emerging as symbols of resilience and strength. One such man was John McCain, a former U.S. Senator and Vietnam War veteran, whose survival in the face of brutal captivity is a story of courage, honor, and determination. That on October 26, 1967, John McCain, a 31-year-old naval aviator, was flying his 23rd bombing mission over North Vietnam as part of Operation Rolling Thunder. His target was a power plant in Hanoi, the heavily fortified capital of North Vietnam. As he maneuvered his A-4E Skyhawk through enemy airspace, a Soviet-made surface-to-air missile, SAM, struck his aircraft. The impact was devastating, tearing off one of his wings and sending the plane spiraling out of control. McCain ejected from the cockpit, but his troubles had only begun. The force of the ejection was so violent that it fractured both of his arms and his right leg. He was unable to control his parachute descent and plunged into Truc Bac Lake in the middle of Hanoi. Struggling to stay afloat with his broken limbs, he nearly drowned, but was soon pulled from the water, only to find himself surrounded by an angry mob of North Vietnamese civilians. The people, furious over the ongoing American bombings, attacked McCain. They kicked, punched, and spat on him as he lay helpless on the ground. One man even stabbed him with a bayonet. Moments later, North Vietnamese soldiers arrived and took him into custody. They dragged his injured body to Hoa Lo Prison, a notorious detention facility known as the Hanoi Hilton. Upon arrival at the prison, McCain's condition was critical. His captors, initially believing he wouldn't survive, refused to give him medical treatment. He was left in a filthy cell, writhing in pain, with open wounds and broken bones. For days, he slipped in and out of consciousness, his body racked with fever and infection. Eventually, when the North Vietnamese discovered that his father, Admiral John S. McCain Jr., was the commander of U.S. forces in the Pacific, they decided to keep him alive, seeing him as a valuable propaganda tool. This was just the beginning of a nearly 6-year-long nightmare, one that would test his endurance, willpower, and spirit like never before. After being captured, John McCain was taken to Hoa Lo Prison, infamously known as the Hanoi Hilton. Despite its misleading name, this was no hotel. It was a place of horrific suffering, where prisoners of war, POWs, endured some of the worst conditions imaginable. The prison was originally built by the French in the late 19th century to detain Vietnamese political prisoners, but during the Vietnam War, it became a facility where captured American soldiers were held and brutally tortured. When McCain arrived at the Hanoi Hilton, he was in horrendous physical condition. His arms and leg were broken, his body was covered in cuts and bruises, and his injuries had become infected due to a lack of medical care. The guards initially refused to treat him, letting him suffer in a filthy, roach-infested cell. With no clean bandages, no antibiotics, and no proper food, his condition deteriorated rapidly. He ran a high fever, drifted in and out of consciousness, and was in unbearable pain. After a few days, the prison authorities realized that McCain was no ordinary prisoner. His father, Admiral John S. McCain Jr., was the commander of U.S. forces in the Pacific. The North Vietnamese saw this as an opportunity. They believed that if they could break John McCain's spirit, they could use him for propaganda, perhaps even force him to denounce American actions in the war. Because of this, they finally agreed to provide medical care, but it was minimal and done with cruelty. McCain's captors reset his broken bones without anesthesia, a process so agonizing that he screamed in pain until he passed out. They repeatedly interrogated him while he was still gravely injured, demanding military information. When he refused, they beat him mercilessly, showing no regard for his already broken body. He was left in a cell measuring only 6.5 feet by 3 feet, barely enough room to lie down. The floors were made of concrete, and the only thing inside was a small bucket for waste. For weeks, McCain was left in solitary confinement, isolated from the other American prisoners. He had no idea whether he would live or die. The stench of rot filled the air, mosquitoes and rats infested his cell, and he was given only meager portions of food, usually a bowl of watery soup with a few grains of rice. His weight plummeted, and he became frail and weak. But physical pain was only part of the suffering at the Hanoi Hilton. The guards employed a range of psychological torture tactics designed to break prisoners mentally and emotionally. Prisoners were told that they had been abandoned by their country. They were subjected to constant threats, beatings, and humiliation. At times, McCain was stripped naked and left exposed for hours or even days at a time. His every movement was monitored, and any slight act of defiance was punished with more beatings. Yet, despite everything he endured at the Hanoi Hilton, McCain refused to give in. He resisted the enemy's attempts to turn him into a propaganda tool, knowing that the moment he complied, it would not only break his spirit but also be used against the United States. Even as the torture intensified, he clung to his sense of duty, honor, and resilience. John McCain's imprisonment at the Hanoi Hilton was not just about confinement. It was about breaking him physically, mentally, and emotionally. The North Vietnamese used a brutal system of torture designed to force prisoners into making false confessions, denouncing their country, and providing military intelligence. McCain, as the son of a high-ranking U.S. admiral, was considered a high-value target, making him a primary focus for relentless abuse. One of the most excruciating torture methods McCain endured was the rope treatment. His captors would tightly bind his arms behind his back, tying his wrists together until his elbows nearly touched. Then, using a rope, they would hoist him off the ground by his arms, dislocating his already broken shoulders. The pain was beyond unbearable, so severe that many prisoners would pass out within minutes. If McCain lost consciousness, the guards would lower him, splash water on his face to revive him, and then hoist him up again, repeating the cycle over and over. His captors also employed continuous beatings, sometimes using wooden clubs, rifle butts, or their fists. His ribs were cracked, his stomach was repeatedly punched, and his face was swollen beyond recognition. On some occasions, the guards would force McCain to kneel on the rough concrete floor for hours at a time, knowing that his shattered leg would cause agonizing pain. If he collapsed from exhaustion, they would beat him even more. Another cruel tactic used against McCain was solitary confinement in complete darkness. He was kept in a tiny cell with no windows, no light, and no human contact for weeks. The silence and darkness were meant to break his will, making him feel utterly alone and forgotten. Studies have shown that extreme isolation can cause hallucinations, severe depression, and even insanity, yet McCain somehow endured it. His diet was another form of torture. Prisoners at the Hanoi Hilton were given barely enough food to survive. A daily ration of watery pumpkin soup, stale bread, and rice filled with rat droppings. Sometimes, the guards would deliberately serve food mixed with dirt, insects, or mold, forcing the prisoners to eat filth or starve. This led to severe malnutrition, causing McCain's body to weaken further. His weight dropped dramatically, and he suffered from chronic diarrhea, infections, and festering wounds that never properly healed. But physical pain was only one side of the torment. Psychological torture was a daily weapon used against McCain. His captors would tell him that the United States had abandoned him, that his family thought he was dead, and that no one was coming to rescue him. They attempted to manipulate him into signing false confessions or denouncing the war effort, often making threats that he would never see his loved ones again unless he cooperated. Despite this unbearable suffering, McCain refused to break. He resisted as long as he could, refusing to sign statements that would betray his country. However, after days of continuous torture, extreme dehydration, and exhaustion, McCain eventually signed a false confession, but not without a defiant act of resistance. Knowing that he could no longer physically withstand the torment, he intentionally wrote a confession filled with nonsense and sarcasm, ensuring that it was useless as propaganda. This act of defiance came at a cost. When the guards realized what he had done, they beat him even more severely, leaving him on the verge of death. But McCain's unwavering spirit, His refusal to truly surrender became a source of inspiration to other POWs. Even in his darkest moments, he remained committed to honor, duty, and resilience. One of the defining moments of John McCain's captivity was his refusal to accept early release, an act that demonstrated his unwavering loyalty to the code of conduct for U.S. military personnel and his fellow prisoners of war. This decision came at a great personal cost, as it led to some of the most severe torture and suffering he would endure during his nearly 6 years of imprisonment. In mid-1968, after 10 months of brutal captivity, the North Vietnamese offered McCain an early release. Their reasoning had nothing to do with compassion. Rather, it was a strategic move for propaganda purposes. By releasing McCain, the son of Admiral John S. McCain Jr., they hoped to show the world that they were treating American prisoners well. More importantly, they aimed to create division and distrust among the other POWs. If McCain accepted release ahead of those who had been imprisoned longer, it would damage the unity and morale of the American prisoners still suffering inside the Hanoi Hilton. McCain knew this was a test of character, not just for himself, but for all American POWs. According to the U.S. Military Code of Conduct, prisoners of war must accept release in the order they were captured. If McCain left, he would be violating this code and betraying his fellow prisoners, some of whom had been in captivity far longer than he had. His father's high military position meant nothing in the eyes of the code. Duty and honor came first. Despite being physically broken, malnourished, and barely able to walk, McCain refused the offer. He told his captors that he would only accept release if every POW captured before him was freed as well. The North Vietnamese were furious. They had expected him to jump at the chance to go home, and when he didn't, they took it as an act of defiance. His rejection of early release had immediate and brutal consequences. In retaliation, his captors increased the intensity of his torture. They subjected him to even more frequent and prolonged beatings, sometimes multiple times a day. His ribs were cracked, his already broken arms were twisted and bent in unnatural ways, and his rope treatment was intensified. He was left hanging by his wrists for hours, his shoulders dislocated again and again. In addition to physical torment, he was thrown into solitary confinement for more than 2 years. In a tiny, windowless cell, he was denied nearly all human contact, left alone with his pain, his thoughts, and the deafening silence. He had no idea whether he would ever leave the prison alive. The isolation was a psychological weapon meant to break him, to make him regret his decision to refuse early release. At times, McCain's health deteriorated so badly that he was at the brink of death. He suffered from untreated infections, open wounds, and chronic dysentery. His body was weak, and his weight had dropped to a dangerously low level. Still, despite everything, he refused to give in. His captors continued to pressure him, dangling the opportunity of freedom before him, hoping that in his weakest moments, he would finally accept. But McCain never did. His decision to stay behind, despite being offered an escape from the nightmare, earned him the respect and admiration of his fellow prisoners. He set an example of unwavering courage and solidarity, showing that even in the darkest of times, principles and honor mattered more than personal survival. John McCain's time at the Hanoi Hilton was marked by unrelenting physical agony, psychological warfare, and the constant battle to maintain his dignity. Yet, despite years of unimaginable suffering, he displayed a level of resilience that few could match. His ability to endure and resist the enemy's efforts to break him became an inspiration, not just to his fellow prisoners, but later to millions around the world. Resilience was not just about surviving. It was about defying his captors in every way possible. McCain understood that the North Vietnamese wanted him to submit, confess, and become a propaganda tool. They wanted him to betray his country and fellow prisoners, hoping that by wearing him down physically and mentally, he would cave in. But no matter how many times he was beaten, left starving, or isolated for months on end, McCain refused to let his spirit be broken. One of the key ways McCain maintained his resilience was through small acts of defiance. Even when forced to write a false confession under extreme torture, he deliberately filled it with nonsense, making it useless as a serious statement. He would memorize names of fellow prisoners, ensuring that if he ever got out, he could report their status. He even found ways to communicate with other prisoners using a tap code system, a form of Morse code that allowed them to secretly pass messages between cells. These acts of defiance, though seemingly small, were powerful. They reminded him, and others, that they were still in control of their minds and willpower, even if they had no control over their bodies. McCain also found strength through camaraderie. Even in solitary confinement, he would tap messages to his fellow POWs, letting them know they were not alone. In moments when he was allowed to be with others, he would share stories, encourage them to hold on, and even crack jokes to keep morale alive. He once recalled that humor was a critical weapon. Even in their darkest hours, the ability to laugh, if only for a moment, was a way to reclaim their humanity. Another remarkable aspect of McCain's resilience was his refusal to be broken by despair. Many prisoners lost all hope, sinking into depression and giving up their will to live. But McCain, despite suffering 2 years of solitary confinement, prolonged torture, and malnutrition, never fully gave into hopelessness. He later admitted that there were moments when he thought he couldn't take it anymore, when he wanted to give up, but he always found a way to push through. Whether it was through memories of his family, thinking about the men who had suffered before him, or sheer stubborn determination, he refused to let his captors see him break. His resilience was also rooted in his belief in something greater than himself. McCain often credited his survival to his faith, his belief in God, his country, and the ideals that he had sworn to protect as a U.S. Navy officer. Even in his weakest moments, when he was starving, sick, and in excruciating pain, he held on to those beliefs as a reason to keep fighting, to keep resisting, and to stay alive. Ultimately, his unwavering resilience was not just about surviving the Hanoi Hilton. It was about proving that the human spirit could not be broken, no matter how much suffering it endured. One of the most crucial elements that helped John McCain endure the horrors of captivity in the Hanoi Hilton was the unbreakable bond he shared with his fellow prisoners of war, POWs. These men, each suffering from their own wounds, isolation, and brutal treatment, formed a brotherhood of survival, supporting one another in ways that often meant the difference between life and death. Prison life was designed to break individuals. The North Vietnamese captors knew that isolation and loneliness were as powerful as physical torture, so they frequently kept prisoners separated, limiting their ability to communicate. However, the American POWs developed a secret code that allowed them to communicate even under the harshest conditions. The tap code, a lifeline in the darkness. One of the most ingenious methods of resistance the prisoners used was the tap code, a system of tapping on the walls to spell out letters in a simple grid system. By using a series of taps, they could secretly communicate between cells without the guards realizing. This was more than just a way to share information. It was a lifeline, a means of maintaining human connection in an environment meant to strip them of their identity. Through the tap code, prisoners shared news, offered encouragement, and signaled distress when torture was particularly severe. Sometimes, it was as simple as tapping out, "GBU, God bless you," letting another prisoner know he was not alone. Other times, it was passing along crucial morale-boosting messages, like reminding each other to resist and survive. McCain would later recall that hearing another man's tap through the walls was one of the most powerful reassurances that he was not alone. Even when he was isolated for 2 years, knowing that his brothers were still out there, still fighting, still holding on, gave him the strength to endure. Acts of brotherhood and sacrifice. The bond between the POWs was not just emotional. It was built on acts of sacrifice. When one prisoner was too weak to eat, others would secretly share their meager portions of rice to keep him alive. If someone was too injured to clean his wounds, a fellow prisoner would risk punishment to help him. McCain himself was the recipient of such acts of kindness. When he was first captured, his broken arms and leg left him unable to feed himself. A fellow prisoner, Bud Day defied the guards' orders and fed McCain, cleaned his wounds, and kept him from slipping into complete despair. Even though it meant certain beatings if caught, Day risked his safety to ensure that McCain didn't die. In return, McCain became a source of strength for others. He took great pride in boosting morale, sharing stories, jokes, and memories to keep spirits up. He also refused to let prisoners give in to despair, reminding them that they were American soldiers, bound by duty and honor, and that they would make it out together. Enduring torture as a team. The North Vietnamese tried to break this brotherhood by forcing POWs to betray one another. They offered food, better conditions, and the chance to avoid torture in exchange for information about their fellow prisoners. However, the code of honor among the men was stronger than any bribe. They refused to name names, refused to confess, and took beatings rather than betray each other. At times, prisoners were tortured in front of others as a way to break their will. McCain himself was often beaten in full view of fellow POWs, the guards hoping that witnessing the torture would make the others lose hope. But instead of despair, it strengthened their resolve. The bond they shared was unshakable. These men, despite enduring hunger, pain, sickness, and isolation, found strength in each other. Their unity was a weapon, a silent act of defiance that no amount of torture could destroy. McCain knew that he was never truly alone, and that belief in brotherhood gave him the strength to survive. After nearly 6 years of brutal captivity, John McCain's time as a prisoner of war finally came to an end. His release was not a result of mercy from his captors, but rather a geopolitical shift, the result of prolonged negotiations between the United States and North Vietnam. The eventual agreement, known as the Paris Peace Accords, was signed in January 1973, leading to the release of 591 American POWs. McCain was among them. However, his return to freedom was not as simple as just walking out of his prison cell. The final days in captivity. As the war neared its conclusion, the treatment of American POWs began to change. The North Vietnamese, now realizing that they would have to return their prisoners, started easing some of the worst forms of torture. The extreme beatings became less frequent, and some prisoners were even allowed to interact with each other for the first time in years. However, this change did not erase the scars, both physical and psychological, that had accumulated over the years. For McCain, the thought of finally leaving the Hanoi Hilton brought mixed emotions. While he longed for freedom, he had spent years preparing his mind for the possibility that he might die in captivity. The sudden shift from the daily struggle to survive to the reality of going home was overwhelming. Many POWs, including McCain, worried about how the outside world had changed and whether they would be able to fit back into it. The moment of release. On March 14, 1973, McCain, along with other POWs, was finally escorted out of the prison. He was weakened, scarred, and still suffering from untreated injuries, but he stood as tall as his broken body would allow. Cameras captured the moment as he and others were handed over to American forces. One of the most powerful images from that day was McCain refusing assistance from his North Vietnamese captors as he limped toward the plane that would take him home. Even though his body was shattered, he would not allow himself to appear weak before the men who had tortured him for nearly 6 years. It was a final act of defiance, a silent message that despite everything, they had failed to break him. The journey home. McCain and the other POWs were taken to Clark Air Base in the Philippines, where they received their first real medical treatment in years. Doctors were shocked at his condition. His bones had healed incorrectly, he had chronic infections, and his weight was dangerously low. Despite everything, McCain refused special treatment, insisting that all POWs be treated equally, regardless of their background or family connections. From the Philippines, he was flown to Jacksonville, Florida, where he reunited with his family. The moment was bittersweet. While he was overjoyed to see his loved ones again, he also felt the weight of the years lost, the experiences that had forever changed him. He was no longer the young, energetic pilot who had been shot down over Vietnam. He was now a man who had endured unimaginable suffering and survived. The psychological and physical toll. McCain's physical injuries were severe and permanent. His arms and leg, never properly treated, left him with a lifelong disability. He could no longer lift his arms above his shoulders, making even simple tasks difficult. His limp was a constant reminder of his time in captivity. But the physical wounds were only part of the story. The psychological effects of nearly 6 years of torture and isolation took a deep toll on him, as they did on many POWs. The transition back to normal life was not easy. For years, he had lived by the strict survival code of a prisoner of war, always prepared for the next interrogation, always expecting another beating. Now, in a world of freedom, he had to relearn how to live without constant fear. McCain would later admit that adjusting to normal life was one of the greatest challenges he faced. Many POWs struggled with post-traumatic stress, nightmares, and a sense of disconnection from the world they had left behind. Some found it difficult to relate to family and friends, who could never fully understand what they had endured. But even in his struggle, McCain showed the same resilience that had helped him survive captivity. Instead of withdrawing into the shadows, he chose to use his experience to serve a greater purpose. He understood that his survival came with a responsibility to honor the memory of those who did not make it back, and to stand up for the men and women who had sacrificed for their country. John McCain's journey from the depths of the Hanoi Hilton to becoming a symbol of resilience and patriotism is one of the most extraordinary stories of survival in modern history. His 6 years as a prisoner of war tested him in every possible way, physically, mentally, and emotionally, but he never surrendered his integrity, loyalty, or love for his country. Despite enduring relentless torture, isolation, and near-death experiences, McCain emerged from captivity not with bitterness, but with a renewed commitment to service. He turned his suffering into a lifelong mission, advocating for fellow veterans, prisoners of war, and those who sacrificed in battle. His experiences shaped his political career, where he stood as a champion of honor, duty, and unwavering courage. McCain's story is not just about survival. It is about the power of resilience, the strength of the human spirit, and the unbreakable bond of brotherhood. His refusal to accept early release, his ability to endure unspeakable pain, and his deep sense of duty to his fellow POWs demonstrated that even in the darkest of times, a person's character is defined by their principles, not their circumstances. His legacy serves as a reminder to all of us that even in the face of overwhelming adversity, we can choose to stand firm, to hold on to our beliefs, and to fight for what is right. John McCain's survival was not just a personal victory. It was a testament to the strength of the human will and the enduring spirit of those who refuse to be broken.